shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sign. When we all get to heaven, what a day.
All right, the Holy Spirit, the fruit of the Spirit. We've talked about love, joy, peace, patience, and now we are talking about kindness. If you're reading from the King James Version, it's the word gentleness that is here. As I look at this word and have done a little bit of study on this word, I think the best way that I can talk about this is that this word is kind of talking about the demeanor of a person. And I'm gonna borrow, and I know he was talking about pornography when he said it, but the Supreme Court justice who was asked about pornography said, well, it's kind of hard to define, but I know it when I see it. That's kind of this. It may be hard to put into concrete words what it means to be gentle, but you know it when you see it. And you know those people, and people look at what he's a gentle soul. You hear that expression from time to time. But what does that mean? Is that simply an attitude? I'll ask it like that. Or is it deeper than that? Is it more than that? What's it mean to be kind? It is very closely connected to love. In fact, right, if you don't love, then you will not be kind. But that right there tells you that it's more than just an attitude. So it involves being. It involves doing. It involves acting, being kind. Gracious is another synonym you might stick in here, but gracious is more than just being graceful in your motion. And it's more than just being warm and inviting in your speech. Gracious, and I think what Wesley said is powerful. It involves providing for people things that they need because you love them. It's not just the doing, just like faith is not just the believing. That's one of the problems that we have with all these terms that we struggle with. The religious world argues about salvation by grace and then say, well, if you have to do anything, well, that's works and that nullifies grace. Well, they miss the fullness of what faith is. Because faith is more than just believing. Faith is believing and then being driven to act. That is faith. Without the doing, James says faith is dead. Just like a body without a spirit is dead. Faith without the doing is dead. It's both of these things. All of these words are just like that. There is an emotional aspect to it or an attitudinal aspect to it, but there's also the doing aspect of it. And so being gracious means, again, that you're sharing with people things that they need. What is the grace of God that has appeared? Titus 2:11, remember what the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation, instructing us to deny ungodliness and worldly desires and to live sensibly and righteously. What is that describing? Something that has appeared into the world that gives man instruction to deny sin and pursue the spiritual things. What does that? The Word of God does. So this is the grace of God. And the process of getting this message to us was God showing grace to man. Because I'm going to tell you something. If he didn't do this, we wouldn't know. We might know something's wrong, but we wouldn't know what we needed to do to fix it. We would be in trouble. So, because he's gracious or he's kind, he acted. He sent the Spirit of truth into the world. He inspired prophets to record his mind so that we could know what he was thinking. Is it, well, I was going to pick somebody else, but I'll pick on Sherry and I. That makes a better object to pick on. Would I be gracious if I expected or needed something of my wife, didn't communicate that need, and then attacked her for failure to provide? Would that be gracious? No. What would I need to do if I would expect help from someone? Which is what God did. That is, that whole mechanism is an expression of grace. And if you turn that on its head, even if you have communicated those needs, but you realize that the person is incapable of doing something, grace would involve what? Being understanding. We're going to see that crop into this picture as well. So being overly harsh is to lack kindness. To demand things of people that they're incapable of is to lack kindness. I'll illustrate this in a way that is very, very clear. You have a 2-year-old, and you tell that 2-year-old, I want your room painted. And you come back an hour later and the room has not been painted. Would it be proper to chastise that 2-year-old for failing to do something that they're not capable of doing? That would not be gracious at all, to expect of someone something that they're completely incapable of. And so there's that aspect of it as well. It means, again, it goes back to this idea of love. It means to respect and to honor and to give consideration to other people. And then to act based upon those things, which is expressed by God in this respect. Because man has sinned, all men deserve to die. But what does God understand? He doesn't want all men to die, right? He loves man. And so he showed grace to man by informing man of a way in which he can escape the consequences of sin, and then providing for that mechanism so that it would be doable, something that we can't do. What he realized, maybe it's not fair to say realized. He's omniscient. He knew from the beginning. But the circumstances is this. Is there a righteous man on earth who continually practices righteousness and who never sins? No, he understands that. So his grace communicates, lets us know that, and says, here is a way. Here is a way for you to be redeemed. So grace works on that side of the scale as well. Good, that's another term that you could use that's kind of equivalent to kind. And not exactly the same word, but serviceable is actually one of the synonyms, serviceable, but that sounds very clinical. What it means is to be effective. Serviceable means to be effective. We need to be effective. That's what it means to be kind, to effectively serve other people, which means I have to give some consideration to them, to their circumstances, to their needs, and then say, okay, what can I do to help? Which, by the way, is exactly what God did. God looked down on the earth and saw the sin of man and said, okay, he has a need. What can I do to help? And then he put a plan into motion to help. And by empathic, he means to have the ability to empathize with someone, to understand the circumstances that they're in. And being kind is then processing and acting on that knowledge. It basically means that we should be respectful of individuals, and it speaks to our ability to be effective in serving their needs. Goodness is the next term on the list. This is good in the sense of moral. This is not good in the sense, oh, he's a good guy. He's funny, he's warm, he hadn't thrown anything at us lately. He's a good neighbor. He keeps his grass cut, keeps his dog on his side of the yard. That's not what this is talking about. This is talking about morally upright. What's the difference between being or having goodness, exhibiting goodness, and kindness? Now, I'm going to tell you something. They wouldn't both be in the list if there isn't a reason. Yes, ma'am.
It's like the first is just like a step, and then that person will not only exhibit, but he will go and start being kind.
Okay. This, I'm using scholars. I'll just go ahead and tell you. This is actually one scholar who is referencing what another scholar said. So Vine is the original source that I touched on, but Vine is actually citing the work of Trench about this word, where he said, kindness, that's the first word we talked about. Kindness speaks to the kindlier, which is, I was always taught you can't use a form of the word to define what you're trying to define, but that's what he does here. Kindliness speaks to the kindlier aspect of goodness. So what he's saying is that goodness is and kindness all belong in the same category. They're just focused on different aspects or different nuances of the idea. So the category is proper acting. And the kindness word is focusing on the way in which you act. And this is, he says, the sterner qualities of being good. And what he uses to define, he said, think of Matthew 21 and Jesus cleansing the temple. Okay, that's not gentleness, but it's still goodness. He was still doing something good, doing something that needed to be done, doing something helpful, doing something that was in keeping with what God desired. But it was pretty stern. And there's another example in Matthew 23 when he addresses the Pharisees very sternly. He was being good, but no one would have read that and said, boy, this is a kind letter. It was a good letter, though. So there are different aspects. I guess the best way to illustrate that is as a parent. Sometimes you hug and kiss your child, and sometimes you swat the back of their hand. Both of them can be exhibiting love. Both of them can be showing care and concern and helping them. One is gentle and one is stern. Lightfoot has said that one speaks about our disposition toward others, and the second, the activity. I disagree with Lightfoot on that. I think activity is involved in all of them. I think all of these things are indistinguishable from the actions that they bear. They start as attitudes and beliefs, but they are completed through the actions that they bear. So I don't draw that distinction as much as he did, but I do want to put it out there because he's not an idiot, and maybe he's right and I'm wrong. But anyway, that's kind of my thinking on this. Goodness can be less warm, but still equally needed. Sometimes you have to be stern. Yes, sir. Right. Which may be even what Lightfoot was trying to get at. And so again, we're talking about, you know, what part of our activity in life following Christ is not to be bearing the fruit of love? And the answer is there's no part of it. Okay, so what part should not express joy? And the answer is, well, there's no joy. We should be filled with joy. Peace. We should be at peace. I've learned to be content in whatever circumstances I'm in. Patience. When should we not be patient? Or long-suffering? And the answer is, well, we're always to be. And that's what I want us to understand. These are not set opposed to one another. These are descriptives of all of our behavior. That's why it's called the fruit of the Spirit and not the fruits of the Spirit. These are different ways of highlighting the nuances of all of our behavior. And so our behavior has to be kind, but it also has to be good. You can be kind to someone while you're walking them down a hall to their death. In fact, that's how most serial killers are so successful. They're believed to be warm and kind and genial and friendly, but in fact, they're malicious. So you can be soft in your approach and gentle in your approach with an evil motive. So goodness has to do with the effect. Is it a good end? Is what I'm saying and doing bringing about what is good? Or is what I'm saying or doing serving myself? There's the contrast. Faithfulness. What's faithfulness? Okay. Any other thoughts, ideas, beliefs, concurrences? Are we all comfortable with that as an exclusive definition and complete definition of faithfulness? Are we all not sure of what a good definition of faithfulness is? Are we all just afraid to talk? Yes, ma'am. I understand. When do you really know something, though? When you can teach it to somebody else. That's when you really know it. You can be taught something and you can understand it and maybe even do it yourself, but if you can't yet explain it, then you don't fully know it. And that's what we're trying to do, is shift from a standpoint of saying, okay, I know that I'm supposed to be faithful, to actually being faithful, to actually being able to help others be faithful. We're trying to move on that continuum. So that's why I'm asking the question, what is faithfulness? Conviction. I'm good with that word. In fact, it's right here. The word refers to our being convicted of things. That's my first point. That's number one under faithfulness on my outline. Conviction, which is what? A strong belief. I think that's probably a common dictionary definition of that word. I believe it is to be convinced, to be certain. Now, people can be convinced about things and be wrong. For me to be certain doesn't mean that it's true, but that the state of my absolutely being persuaded and convinced that the matter is such. And then when you add ness to the end of it, that's the definition of faithful, but we're talking about faithfulness. So you add that to the end of this word, what do we say? You practice what that conviction demands. And in this context, it's a conviction that arises from the truth that emanated from the Spirit. And so we're being led by the Spirit. We have listened to what the Spirit has revealed. We are convinced that it is true. And faithfulness, therefore, means that then I act. And when do I act? Just today? It's the continual process. Which, by the way, we can go back and apply to every one of these other words that have this ness stuck on the back of it. Gentleness, kindness, faithfulness. This continuing behavior. Now, if you stumble and fall and you get your focus thrown back onto the flesh instead of the Spirit, and you do something that's not kind, that's not gentle, that's not faithful. By the way, I would suggest that anything that you do that is not faithful to God in some way is also not kind and not good and not gentle and not patient or any of those other things. So again, don't separate these things out too much. But if you are being led by the Spirit, is it possible for your attention to be drawn away at a moment? And the answer is yes. But faithfulness demands what? That you return back, that you realize. So you look at David, and David turned and focused on his flesh for a while in his dealings with Bathsheba. And in fact, that lasted over the course of days and led to some really bad behavior. What he was doing was not good. But did he return back to pursuing the things of the Spirit? And when you look at his life, was he faithful? And the answer is yes. And so that we're not talking about flawless. It doesn't. The fruit of the Spirit is not flawlessness. Do you see that in the list anywhere? Flawlessness? No, it's faithfulness. If you have a vehicle that's faithful, does it mean that it's got a shiny paint job? Does it mean that it's got all the bells and whistles? What's it mean that you got a faithful vehicle? You can depend on it. You stick your key in, it starts. You put it in gear, it drives. I had one, by the way, that was pretty faithful to me, except if you stopped at a red light, you had to slide it down into neutral and give it a little bit of gas or it would die. And it may not start again after it died. But as long as you treated it right, it got you where you needed to go, and it got you back home, and everything was good. And it started every time. It never left me stranded anywhere. It was a faithful vehicle, but it had a dent, and the paint was getting bad, and it didn't have anything on it. It had an AM radio in the dash. That was it. Did have an air conditioner that didn't always work. But it was dependable as a means of transportation. Got me back and forth to school, got me back and forth to work. Never left me stranded. Faithfulness. What this is talking about is being persuaded by the truth of the gospel in such a manner that my behavior reflects that. If you believe this is true, then there are certain things that ought to arise from that. If you believe that God is, and that God created all things, and that God is a benevolent, loving God who has created you and is trying to say, what naturally arises from that? If you believe all the doctrine about God, we're not talking about man, we're not talking about all the doctrine about God, what naturally arises when you realize that you've got an omnipotent God who is expressing love and grace towards you, kindness and care. What does that lead to? Well, it does do that. So you're humble before God, which means that you don't approach God telling God what you want. You do what? You ask him what he wants. All that arises naturally. What else arises naturally? If you do something gracious and kind to someone, what do you expect them to do? Be thankful, to have gratitude. If I believe what the Bible says about God, then I'm someone who is grateful to God for what he has done. Which would then cause me to do what? Express praise and thanksgiving. What is expression of praise and thanksgiving? Worship. If you believe the testimony of the Bible about God, worship of God is the natural outcropping. People, therefore, that do not worship God are being unfaithful. And people that only occasionally worship God are not practicing faithfulness. They are. There's other ways that we rob God. But I want us to understand that what we're saying is that if you are convinced of the truth of these things, there is behavior that should follow and be a consistent part of your life forever. Now, are there days that you cannot physically worship potentially? Yeah. Let's say I'm in a terrible car accident and I'm in a coma. Am I going to worship? But if I'm cognizant and aware and able to control my life, I engage in worship because I know whom I believed. I'm persuaded that he's able to do what he's promised, and I want to express my gratitude and my appreciation and my love for those things. And that's worship. That's praise. And if you got to convince yourself to worship, you probably have a faith problem. And you're certainly not practicing faithfulness, which says that my general attitude, my general disposition, and my general behavior should be the expression of faith. So that if someone looks at me, they say what? He is dependably lifting up the name and the glory of God in the hearts of those around him. And it shouldn't be confined to four walls. Outside of this room, when people talk to me, they should hear about and see the reflection of my gratitude and thanksgiving to God. I got to stop. So we are, I guess, on gentleness next time. We're definitely going to finish the list next time because we got gentleness and self-control left. Although self-control is my favorite. It really is. I appreciate your presence, your participation this morning. We're not to this slide yet, so ignore that. Pretend like you didn't see it.